I invited her for the Champions League final. She scored and never left the bed. The digital spark. Diego Santoro refreshed his email for the 7th time that hour, though he told himself he wasn't waiting for anything specific. The architectural renderings for the Como Stadium renovation sat untouched on his second monitor while his primary screen displayed the football photography forum where he'd spent far too many evening hours lately. Then her username appeared, Cam Captures Goals, with a new message. Your analysis of San Siro's acoustic design made me cry actual tears. Attaching the photo series I shot there last month. Tell me if the angles capture what you described. He opened the attachments and felt something shift in his chest. She'd photographed the empty stadium at dawn, light streaming through the stands in ways that revealed the cathedral-like architecture he'd tried to explain in clumsy words. She saw spaces the way he did, but through a lens that somehow made them more alive. That was 6 months ago. Since then, they'd traded messages almost daily, a comfortable rhythm that had become the best part of his routine. She'd send him photos from Camp Nou or the Bernabeu with questions about structural history. He'd sketch quick drawings explaining weight distribution in historic stands. Somewhere between the technical discussions, they'd started sharing other things. Her frustration with gallery owners who didn't understand football culture, his loneliness in a city he'd moved to for work but never quite fit into. He knew basic facts. Camila was based in Barcelona, traveled constantly for her documentary project on European football culture, had a Colombian mother and Spanish father who'd raised her between Bogotá and Madrid. She knew he was divorced, had no children, and lived alone in an apartment near Porto Venezia with a projector setup that was probably excessive for one person. Champions League final next Wednesday, he typed before he could overthink it. I have a projector, a decent sound system, and I make exceptional ossobuco. If your documentary work brings you anywhere near Milan, the view from my couch is worth the trip. He stared at the message for 3 full minutes before hitting send. The risk felt enormous, shifting 6 months of careful digital friendship into something tangible and therefore more dangerous. His cursor hovered over the delete button. Her reply came faster than his racing pulse, a voice message. He clicked play, and her voice filled his apartment for the first time, warm with a slight rasp and an accent that moved fluidly between Spanish and English. Diego. I've been waiting for you to ask something like this. I'm shooting in Turin on Tuesday anyway. Send me your address. I'll bring my camera and terrible opinions about Inter's defensive strategy. He laughed out loud in his empty apartment, a sound that surprised him with its lightness. His fingers moved across the keyboard. You're going to insult my team in my own home. Only if you're brave enough to let me in, came her almost instant response, followed by a winking emoji that made his stomach flip in a way he hadn't felt since his early 20s. Diego looked around his apartment, seeing it suddenly through the eyes of someone who'd only known him through words and photographs. The exposed brick he'd restored himself, the bookshelves built from reclaimed stadium seats, the walls covered in framed architectural drawings of iconic football venues. It was the space of someone who'd built a life around solitary passions, and he was about to invite someone into it who might understand why. You're brave enough to come, he typed back. Book me a seat. Santoro. I never miss a final. First touch. Camila stepped off the train at Milano Central with a leather camera bag slung across her chest and a vintage AC Milan scarf wrapped deliberately around her neck. She'd texted him a photo 10 minutes earlier with the caption, "Wore this just to test your hospitality limits." Diego was waiting at the platform barrier, and the first thing she noticed was how his photographs hadn't captured the way he moved, all nervous energy barely contained in a lean frame. He wore a faded Inter shirt and an expression caught between amusement and mock outrage. You're trying to get thrown back on the train, he said, but he was smiling, and when she stepped close enough, he kissed both her cheeks in greeting, lingering just a fraction longer than casual. If your loyalty is that fragile, this was never going to work, she teased, letting him take her overnight bag. Up close, he smelled like coffee and something woodsy, and his eyes were warmer brown than they'd appeared in his profile picture. They took the metro to his neighborhood, and the awkwardness she'd feared never materialized. Instead, conversation flowed exactly as it had online, except now she could watch the way his hands moved when he explained things, expressive and precise. At a small trattoria near his apartment, they shared carbonara and a bottle of Sangiove's while the dinner crowd hummed around them. Tell me the truth, Camila said, twirling wine in her glass. When you invited me, what did you actually expect would happen? Diego met her eyes, and something flickered there, honest and vulnerable. I expected I'd probably lose my nerve and cancel. But I didn't want to watch another final alone, and I didn't want to keep pretending that talking to you wasn't the best part of my day. Her breath caught. She reached across the table and laced her fingers through his, feeling the slight tremor in his hand. I booked the ticket before I even replied to you. I've wanted to meet you since you explained why the curve at Anfield creates that specific acoustic resonance. Anyone who understands spaces like that understands something important, he finished. Understands me, she corrected. They walked back through lamplit streets, shoulders brushing, then hands finding each other again with increasing boldness. At his building entrance, Diego hesitated. The match isn't until tomorrow evening. I have a guest room if you'd prefer. Camila turned to face him fully, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly. Diego, I didn't fly here for a guest room. He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 6 months. Good. Because I didn't invite you for one. His apartment was exactly as she'd imagined, beautiful and lonely, waiting for someone to make it feel lived in. He gave her a tour that ended at the window overlooking the city lights, and when he stood behind her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, she leaned back into him. Tomorrow's match, she said softly. Who are you supporting? Does it matter? His voice was low near her ear. She turned in the circle of his almost embrace. No. Not even a little bit. The kiss started gentle, tentative, like they were both afraid of breaking something precious. But then her hands found his hair, and his palmed her waist, and gentleness gave way to 6 months of wanting compressed into a single urgent moment. They broke apart, breathing hard. We should probably. Diego started. Sleep, Camila finished. We should definitely get some sleep. But neither of them moved, and when he kissed her again, slower this time, savoring, she knew that sleep was the last thing either of them wanted. The match was tomorrow. Tonight was theirs. The match and the moment. Match day arrived with golden afternoon light streaming through Diego's windows. They'd slept late, tangled together in his bed after hours of talking and kissing and exploring the boundaries of restraint. Camila woke first, studying the way sunlight caught in his hair, the peaceful vulnerability of his sleeping face. When his eyes opened and found her watching, his smile was pure contentment. Good morning, Milan, she whispered. Good morning, Barcelona, he replied, pulling her closer for a lazy kiss that threatened to derail the entire day. They made breakfast together, moving around his kitchen with surprising ease. She photographed him cooking, the domestic intimacy of it, and he pretended to protest while clearly loving the attention. The sexual tension from the night before hadn't dissipated, just evolved into something richer, anticipation mixed with the comfort of knowing what was inevitable. By evening, his living room was transformed. The projector hummed, casting the pre-match coverage across his wall in vivid detail. They'd pushed the sofa back, arranged cushions on the floor, prepared food they'd probably forget to eat. Camila wore one of his inter-shirts, having finally surrendered her Milan scarf, and the sight of her in his colors did something to his heart rhythm. If your team loses, I'm here to console you, she said, settling beside him as the teams walked onto the pitch. If they win, you're here to celebrate with me, he countered, his hand finding her thigh. The match began with explosive energy. They tried to focus, providing commentary, analyzing tactics, but every brush of shoulders, every shared glance carried the weight of everything unsaid. At half-time, scoreless, Diego went to refill their wine and returned to find Camila stretched across the cushions, the shirt riding up to reveal the curve of her waist. You're trying to distract me from the second half, he accused softly. Is it working? She looked up at him through her lashes. Instead of answering, he set down the wine and lowered himself beside her, his hand tracing the exposed skin above her jeans. We should watch the match. We absolutely should, she agreed, but her fingers were already pulling him down to her. The kiss ignited everything they'd been holding back. His weight settled over her as her legs wrapped around him, and suddenly the match was just noise in the background. They shed clothes between breathless laughs and urgent touches, discovering each other with the intensity of people who'd waited too long and couldn't wait another second. When a roar from the television indicated someone had scored, neither of them could have said which team. Diego's mouth was tracing the column of her throat, her nails dragging across his back, and the only goal that mattered was the way she gasped his name when his hand slid between them. They made it to his bedroom in a tangle of limbs and discarded clothing, the projector still casting flickering light into the hallway. On his bed, Diego paused, framing her face with his hands. "Camila, this is everything," she finished, pulling him down. "This is everything." Their lovemaking was tender and fierce by turns, months of digital longing made physical. She learned he was generous and attentive, that he paid attention to every sound she made. He discovered she was unafraid to ask for what she wanted, that her confidence was the most arousing thing he'd ever encountered. Later, much later, tangled in sheets with her head on his chest, they heard the distant sound of the final whistle through his open window, followed by celebrating or mourning in the streets below. Neither of them knew who'd won. Neither of them cared. The night that lasted forever, the city sounds faded as night deepened, leaving only the quiet rhythm of their breathing and the occasional whisper of sheets. Camila traced patterns across Diego's chest, her fingertips following the lines of muscle and bone like she was memorizing a map she never wanted to forget. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," she murmured against his skin as Diego's hand moved through her hair, gentle and possessive at once. "I stopped believing I'd feel this way about someone. After my marriage ended, I convinced myself that this kind of connection was something I'd already had my chance at." She lifted her head to look at him, and in the dim light from the window, her eyes were luminous. "And now? Now I think maybe I was just waiting for someone who understood the same language I speak." He pulled her up until they were face to face, nose to nose. Architecture and football and the spaces between things that matter. Camila kissed him softly, then deeper, feeling him respond beneath her. "I photographed empty stadiums for 2 years before I understood what I was really looking for. It wasn't the spaces themselves. It was the feeling of anticipation, the moment before something extraordinary happens." "Is this extraordinary?" he asked, his hand sliding down her back. "This is the moment the stadium erupts," she whispered, and then they were moving together again, slower this time, taking their time to explore and worship and discover. She learned that he was ticklish along his ribs, that he made this particular sound when she kissed behind his ear, that his control shattered beautifully when she took charge. He discovered the sensitive spot at the base of her spine, the way she arched when he whispered in Italian, how her confidence melted into something vulnerable and trusting in his arms. Between rounds of lovemaking, they raided his kitchen at 2 in the morning, feeding each other cold pasta and laughing about the match they'd completely ignored. Diego lifted her onto the counter, standing between her legs, and they got distracted again, her gasps echoing off the tiles as his mouth traveled down her throat. Back in bed as dawn approached, exhausted and sated, Camila lay sprawled across him, one leg hooked over his hip, her hair a wild curtain across his pillow. "I'm supposed to fly back this afternoon," she said quietly, his arms tightened around her. "Supposed to. I have an exhibition meeting on Thursday. Edit sessions booked through next week." But her voice held no conviction, and her fingers were drawing lazy circles on his stomach, drifting lower. Diego caught her hand, brought it to his lips. "What if you didn't go back?" "Not yet. I'd miss my meetings." "You'd miss your meetings," he agreed, rolling them over so he was above her, settling between her thighs. "But you'd be here." She pulled him down for a kiss that tasted like possibility and morning and the reckless abandon of choosing desire over obligation. "I'd be here," she confirmed against his mouth. They made love again as sunrise painted the room gold, tender and unhurried, like they had all the time in the world because they were choosing to make that true. When they finally slept, wrapped around each other so completely it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began, the city woke up outside, but inside Diego's apartment, time had stopped mattering. The afternoon sun eventually woke them. Camila's phone buzzed with messages she ignored. Diego's laptop sat closed on his desk, work forgotten. They showered together, which predictably led to her pressed against the tile, his name a prayer on her lips, water cascading over their joined bodies. The new season. They finally emerged from the bedroom in the late afternoon, wearing his shirts and satisfied smiles, moving around each other with the easy intimacy of long-time lovers rather than people who'd met in person just 2 days ago. Diego made coffee while Camila sat on his counter, camera in hand, capturing him in the domestic light. "I'm cancelling my flight," she announced, reviewing the photos. He looked up from the espresso machine, hope and caution warring in his expression. "For how long?" "I don't know yet." She set down the camera and reached for him, pulling him close to stand between her knees. "But I know I'm not ready to leave. I know that what happened here wasn't just about the excitement of finally meeting. I know that I've been half living my life, moving from city to city without ever landing anywhere, and standing in your kitchen feels more like home than anywhere I've been in years." Diego's hands settled on her waist, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. "I have a guest room full of storage. It could be an office. A dark room. Whatever you need. Are you asking me to move in after one night together?" She was smiling, but her voice wavered with emotion. "I'm asking you to stay long enough to find out if what we both feel is real or just the best night of our lives." He pulled back to meet her eyes. "Though honestly, Camila, I already know. I've known since you sent me those San Siro photographs. I've known since your first voice message. I've known since you walked off that train wearing a Milan scarf just to test me." She laughed, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I have an apartment in Barcelona full of things I barely care about. I have projects I can do from anywhere. I have a whole life I built around not needing anyone." She cupped his face in her hands. "And I have this feeling in my chest that says none of that matters as much as this. As you. As us." They kissed, slow and deep, sealing promises neither of them had planned to make but both knew were true. When they broke apart, Diego lifted her down from the counter, keeping her close. "So you'll stay?" "I'll stay. We'll figure out the logistics, the practicalities, all of it." She grinned up at him. "But first, you're going to tell me who actually won that match we didn't watch." He laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. "I have absolutely no idea." "Perfect. Then we'll watch the replay tonight. Actually watch it this time." "Probably not," he admitted, his hands sliding under her shirt. "Definitely not," she agreed, pulling him toward the bedroom again. Later, as evening painted the sky in shades of violet and gold, they lay tangled in sheets that smelled like both of them, like the collision of two lives becoming one. Camila's camera sat on the nightstand, full of images that would never be exhibited but would mean everything. Diego cooking breakfast, light through his windows, the unmade bed that had become their world, his hands in her hair, her smile caught in unguarded joy. "I came here for a football match," she said softly. "And stayed for everything else," he finished, kissing her temple. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the small miracle happening in a third-floor apartment near Porto Venezia, where two people who'd found each other in the digital spaces between loneliness had discovered that sometimes the greatest victories happen when you're brave enough to invite someone in, vulnerable enough to stay, and open enough to recognize that love doesn't follow a schedule or respect carefully built walls. They'd missed the match. They'd found each other. And in the arithmetic of the heart, that was the only score that mattered. Lessons from the heart. First, true connection transcends distance and time. When souls recognize each other, geography becomes merely a detail to solve, not a barrier to surrender to. Second, vulnerability is not weakness but the doorway to intimacy. The courage to invite someone into your carefully built solitude can transform isolation into belonging. Third, the greatest love stories begin when we stop protecting ourselves from possibility and start believing we deserve the extraordinary, even when it arrives unexpectedly wrapped in a rival team's scarf.